The earth grew silent, and the fields lay barren. The wind carried the dry, bitter scent of dust instead of the sweetness of ripened grain. Rain had refused to fall for seasons that stretched into years, and the soil, once fertile and yielding, cracked under the relentless sun. Humans who had come to rely on the bounty of crops now faced a world stripped of abundance. Hunger pressed down like a heavy stone on every village, every family, every individual, and survival became an act of courage unlike any before. At first, they tried to endure with what remained. The roots of hardy plants, twisted and gnarled, were dug up from parched soil. Leaves, often bitter or fibrous, were boiled to extract the smallest measures of nutrition. Bark, once used only for tools or shelter, became a last resort meal. Every bite carried both sustenance and the reminder of scarcity. Every chew was accompanied by the gnawing anxiety of how much longer this famine could last. Water, too, became precious. Rivers dwindled to shallow trickles, ponds dried into cracked mud, and wells yielded only brackish or bitter liquid. Humans learned to read the landscape carefully, searching for moisture in hidden hollows, beneath rocks or in the roots of certain plants. They discovered that some roots held water, that certain tree barks absorbed dew overnight, and that even the clay of riverbeds could be used to supplement the diet in desperate moments. Every drop consumed was a careful calculation between survival and scarcity. Hunger reshaped communities. Cooperation became essential. Families shared what little food they could find, and villages organized hunts or foraging expeditions into dangerous, unfamiliar terrain. Children were taught early which plants were edible, which roots could be boiled into nourishment, and which barks were safe to chew. Knowledge of the land became a lifeline, passed from elder to child in whispered instructions and patient demonstrations. Survival depended as much on information as on strength, yet hunger drove humans to unimaginable creativity. When crops failed, they experimented with plants that had never before been considered food. Seeds normally discarded were ground into flour, leaves once thought inedible were boiled into stews, and even insects, larvae, and grubs became essential sources of protein. Clay, surprisingly, was sometimes consumed in tiny amounts, not for nutrition, but to settle the stomach, to stave off the gnawing emptiness that otherwise threatened to consume both body and spirit. Every experiment was an act of desperation, yet also a testament to human ingenuity. Communities also learned to store and preserve food with extreme care. Seeds from the last remaining crops were hidden, buried, or guarded by vigilant watchers. Roots were dried and stored in pits lined with stones. Bark was stripped and prepared for long-term use, and even insects or small game were carefully dried or smoked for later consumption. Humans discovered that survival depended not only on immediate nourishment, but on planning, patience, and the foresight to anticipate the needs of tomorrow. The famine reshaped work and life. Villages expanded their foraging to forests, hills, and riversides where food was scarce but possible to find. Hunting became more coordinated, often requiring ambushes, traps, or driving game over long distances. Humans learned to ration each catch carefully, sharing portions to ensure that as many survived as possible. Every decision carried weight. Overhunt today, and tomorrow's scarcity would be even more severe. Fail to gather roots efficiently, and the night might bring weakness, illness, or death. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Parents shielded them as best they could, carefully dividing portions, teaching techniques to survive on the smallest amounts, and preparing for the harsh nights when hunger gnawed at the tribe. Stories were told around fires not only to preserve culture, but to convey crucial survival lessons. Each tale contained information about which roots were safe, which barks could be chewed, and how to find water when the rivers ran dry. Oral history became the repository of life itself. Even in desperation, humans retained resilience. The famine demanded endurance, but it also sparked innovation. Tools were sharpened for digging roots, baskets were woven to carry foraged food, and fire became essential not only for warmth, but for processing edible plants and cooking bark or insects into digestible forms. Every act, no matter how small, was an assertion of life against the overwhelming scarcity that surrounded them. The famine also tested human psychology. Hunger magnified fear, anger, and frustration, yet it also strengthened bonds. Communities that cooperated, that shared knowledge and resources, survived longer. Those who hoarded or fought over scraps often fell first. Hunger became a teacher, reinforcing lessons of patience, strategy, and empathy. It revealed both the fragility and the resilience of humanity in stark relief. And yet, even as famine tightened its grip, humans discovered that scarcity could sharpen awareness. They became attuned to subtle cues in the environment, where certain roots grew only after a particular rain, which tree barks were safest to strip, how clay could be softened or combined with other plant material to supplement meals. Observation, experimentation, and memory became as crucial as any spear or tool. Knowledge became nourishment for the mind when food was scarce for the body. Over time, humans developed rituals around famine survival. The collection of roots, bark, or clay became a disciplined practice, often accompanied by chants or songs to maintain morale. Elders taught children the rhythms of foraging, guiding them patiently through techniques that maximized yield while minimizing danger. Every act of gathering became not only a necessity but a lesson, a method of embedding survival skills into the next generation. Through hunger, scarcity, and relentless challenge, humans endured. They discovered that survival was not only about consumption, but about strategy, creativity, and collective effort. The famine revealed the depth of human resilience, showing that even in the absence of abundance, life could persist. Every root dug, every bark chewed, every clay morsel swallowed was a triumph against the void, a testament to the determination of humans to endure when the earth itself seemed to turn against them. As the famine deepened, the earth seemed to shrink beneath human feet. Fields that had once been abundant lay barren, rivers shrank to thin ribbons of life, and forests yielded only the toughest roots and bitterest barks. Hunger gnawed at the body with relentless precision, and every day became a calculation of movement, energy, and survival. Humans realized that remaining in one place meant slow starvation, and so, guided by instinct, memory, and the stories of elders, they began to move. Migration became a necessity. Tribes traversed frozen plains, arid hills, and desolate valleys in search of anything that might sustain life. Children clutched the hands of parents, elders leaned on canes or younger shoulders, and even the weakest were carried when possible. Every journey was a gamble. The land offered scarce food, predators lurked in hidden places, and weather itself could be fatal. Yet staying still was no longer an option. Motion was survival. Along the way, humans discovered forgotten landscapes. Abandoned riverbeds offered roots and moisture hidden beneath layers of soil. Rocky hillsides concealed tubers and bulbs. Decayed trees could be stripped for fibrous bark or the occasional insect hidden inside. Even clay, consumed sparingly, could settle the stomach when nothing else remained. Each discovery was a small victory, a reminder that life could be coaxed from the harshest corners of the world with patience and ingenuity. Hunger reshaped the human body as well as the mind. Muscles weakened, joints ached from long treks, and energy ebbed away with each passing day. Yet, paradoxically, the mind often sharpened. Humans became intensely observant, noticing footprints, animal trails, and changes in the wind or temperature that signaled water or edible plants. They learned to ration not only food but energy itself, walking only when necessary, sleeping strategically to conserve warmth, and timing hunts or foraging for maximum efficiency. Survival became a balance of knowledge, endurance, and careful calculation. The famine also tested morality. Scarcity could breed desperation and conflict, yet it also reinforced empathy and cooperation. Tribes that shared what little they had often fared better than those who hoarded resources. Elders mediated disputes, reminding the young that survival required unity, not division. Even in the darkest hours, the bonds between humans, family, tribe, and community were a vital lifeline, often more essential than any root, bark, or morsel of clay. Illness and weakness were constant threats. Malnutrition made humans vulnerable to disease, infections, and frostbite. Wounds that might have healed quickly in times of abundance became dangerous, sometimes fatal. The sick were cared for by family members who improvised treatments from herbs, water, and patience. Every act of care was a lesson, a ritual of survival, and a reminder that endurance was as much about nurturing others as it was about individual strength. The famine reshaped human knowledge. Techniques for identifying edible roots, bark, and clay were refined. Observation of animal behavior became essential. If birds or small mammals avoided a plant, it was likely unsafe. If insects swarmed around a root, it could be nourishing. Humans learned to mix different types of meager foods to extract the most nutrition possible, often discovering creative combinations that sustained them when nothing else would. Each insight became a lesson passed down to the next generation. Psychologically, the famine was a crucible. Hunger created despair, anxiety, and fear, yet it also forged resilience. Humans developed rituals to maintain morale, songs that mimicked the rustle of leaves, chants that measured breaths and steps, stories that reminded them of ancestors who had survived even harsher times. The mind became a tool for endurance, learning to reinterpret suffering as a challenge to be overcome rather than a sentence to accept. Predators remained a lurking danger. Wolves, bears, and opportunistic scavengers took advantage of weakened humans. The starving had to move cautiously, using knowledge of terrain, camouflage, and sound to avoid attacks. Fire, even a small flame, became a portable shield, protecting against both the cold and the prowling beasts. Every step forward was a careful negotiation with a world that seemed determined to test the limits of human resilience. Even the environment offered subtle lessons. Humans learned to follow migrating herds, which could lead to fresh plants or hunted game. Seasonal patterns were observed. Certain roots were more nutritious after the first frost. Some bark softened with the rains, and clay deposits could be identified by color and texture. Every observation became critical intelligence, a guide to surviving when the world seemed to offer nothing. Despite the hardships, humans adapted. They organized hunts and foraging expeditions with military precision, rationed food carefully, and preserved knowledge of edible resources. Each journey, each meal scavenged from the bare earth, was a triumph against overwhelming scarcity. Hunger became a teacher, forging a generation skilled in observation, endurance, cooperation, and creativity. Survival depended not only on strength, but on wisdom, foresight, and unity. Through famine, humans discovered that life was not guaranteed, yet it could be extended through cleverness and persistence. The roots dug, the bark chewed, the clay consumed sparingly, all became symbols of resilience. Communities endured because knowledge, cooperation, and ingenuity transformed scarcity into a structured challenge, one that could be met with patience and determination. Every sunrise brought not just hunger but also opportunity, the chance to learn, adapt, and persist in a world stripped to its barest essentials. Hunger was not only a battle of body, it was a battle of mind. The gnawing emptiness in the stomach became a constant companion, and with it came anxiety, fear, and despair. Yet humans discovered that survival required more than physical endurance. It demanded the cultivation of resilience, patience, and mental fortitude. They learned to use rituals, stories, and collective action to transform fear into focus, desperation into strategy. Around dwindling fires, elders began to speak in hushed tones, teaching lessons embedded in the rhythm of life. Stories recounted ancestors who had survived famine, who had eaten roots, bark, or even clay to endure long winters. Every tale served a dual purpose: to preserve knowledge of survival techniques and to instill hope. The young listened with wide eyes, absorbing not only practical instruction but also the emotional strength that carried them through endless days of scarcity. Rituals emerged as anchors in an unpredictable world. Before foraging expeditions, humans would perform simple ceremonies, a quiet moment of gratitude to the land, a gesture of respect toward the trees and roots they would harvest, a whispered acknowledgement of the food that had sustained life before. These acts created structure in chaos, a sense of control when the environment seemed indifferent. Even a small fire, carefully tended and circled by humans, became a symbol of order, warmth, and endurance. Community became the heart of survival. Humans discovered that no individual could endure famine alone. Families shared meager portions, guided the young and infirm, and organized themselves to maximize efficiency. Every act of cooperation, from carrying a sick elder to dividing scarce food, was a lesson in strategy and empathy. Survival was as much about social intelligence as physical endurance, the ability to read faces, anticipate needs, and coordinate. Effort determined which tribes endured and which vanished. Even play and creativity found a place amidst hunger. Children, despite the gnawing emptiness, imitated adults' foraging and hunting techniques, turning survival into a game of skill. They crafted miniature tools, practiced tracking in safe areas, and played roles that mirrored adult responsibilities. Through play, knowledge was embedded early, ensuring that each new generation carried the accumulated wisdom of famine-hardened ancestors. Humor, song, and improvisation softened the sharp edges of deprivation, giving humans the strength to persevere. Fear, too, became a teacher. The knowledge that starvation could weaken the body, leaving one vulnerable to predators or exposure, heightened alertness and sharpened senses. Every rustle of leaves, every distant howl, every shadow became meaningful. Humans learned to anticipate danger, not only from scarcity but also from the creatures that survived alongside them. Fear, when harnessed, guided movement, informed decisions, and reinforced vigilance. The mind became a tool as vital as hands or tools in the quest for survival. The environment itself dictated new patterns of living. Humans learned which plants thrived even in drought, which roots provided water as well as nutrition, and which barks could sustain the stomach temporarily. They discovered hidden springs, shaded hollows, and even clay deposits that, when consumed, sparingly eased hunger pains. Every observation became encoded as knowledge to be passed down. The line between survival and extinction was drawn in these subtle lessons, learned through trial, error, and meticulous attention. Even scarcity sparked innovation. Humans began to store food in new ways, drying roots and barks, preserving seeds, and improvising containers from bark, leaves, or clay. Tools were adapted for digging and harvesting, small improvements yielding greater efficiency. Every small advancement increased the odds of survival, turning desperation into experimentation. Hunger, once only a source of suffering, became a catalyst for ingenuity. Cultural practices evolved to reinforce survival knowledge. Songs mimicked the sounds of water or rustling plants, allowing humans to teach others through rhythm and memory. Chants mark the time needed to boil roots, soften bark, or conserve energy during foraging trips. Storytelling, ritual, and music became intertwined with survival, encoding practical wisdom into emotional and social memory. In this way, humans turned the mental strain of famine into a structured, teachable process that strengthened both individuals and the tribe. Humans also adapted psychologically. Endurance became a practice of both mind and body. Small successes, a discovered route, a safe shelter, a shared meal, became powerful motivators. Gratitude, even for the smallest portion, transformed despair into determination. Observation and memory were trained rigorously, as a forgotten detail could mean wasted energy or illness. Every day of famine became both a test and a lesson, sharpening intellect and fortifying spirit. Despite exhaustion, illness, and the ever-present gnaw of hunger, humans endured. The combination of rituals, storytelling, and community reinforced resilience, creating a structure in a world stripped to its barest essentials. Knowledge became lifeblood, social bonds became armor. Even in the face of extreme scarcity, humans discovered that endurance was not just about consuming food, but about consuming knowledge, cooperation, and memory, integrating them into every action. Through famine, humans discovered the limits of their own bodies and minds and how to transcend them. The bitterest roots, the toughest bark, and even small amounts of clay were transformed into lessons of ingenuity, patience, and adaptation. Every shared morsel became an emblem of strategy and care, every story a blueprint for survival, and every ritual a thread linking generations. Humans were fragile, yet capable, starving, yet unbroken. And so, as the sun rose on barren fields, humans moved, worked, and endured. They had learned that hunger could teach as much as it could punish. Scarcity had revealed not only the vulnerabilities of the body, but the resilience of the mind, the power of community, and the unyielding capacity to innovate. Survival was no longer merely a fight for food, it was a testament to the strength of intelligence, culture, and will, ensuring that even in the harshest famines, humanity would persist. When the earth refused to yield sustenance, humans began to move. Migration was no longer a choice, but a necessity, a test of endurance, strategy, and courage. Families packed what they could carry, a few tools, scraps of dried food, furs for warmth, and seeds to sow if new lands proved fertile. Every step was measured, every route chosen with care, for the journey itself could mean life or death. The familiar plains and forests were left behind, replaced by unknown valleys, frozen hills, and rivers whose currents were difficult to read. The migration demanded ingenuity. Humans discovered that survival was as much about planning as it was about movement. Paths were mapped by observation of animal migrations, flowing water, and wind patterns. Elders remembered the lessons of drought, guiding young feet across difficult terrain, warning of hidden dangers, and pointing out edible roots or bark along the way. Children, though small and vulnerable, became apprentices in the art of endurance, learning to spot signs in the land that could mean the difference between life and starvation. In these new lands, humans adapted. They discovered plants that thrived in unexpected conditions, tubers buried deep beneath arid soil, bark from hardy trees that provided both sustenance and medicinal properties, and seeds that could be stored for months, in the dry earth. Clay, once a last resort filler, was carefully analyzed. In small, safe quantities, it could calm hunger and even supplement essential minerals. Observation, trial, and error became the keys to understanding and mastering the new environment. The climate shaped every decision. In arid regions, humans learned to travel during cooler hours, rest in shaded hollows, and ration water with precision. In colder areas, movement was timed with the sun's warmth, and insulation became essential. Fires were maintained not only for warmth and cooking, but also to signal location and scare off predators. Humans learned to use snow and ice to preserve limited food, to track animal movements across frozen plains, and to build temporary shelters that could withstand storms. Every adaptation was a testament to human ingenuity and resilience. Hunting and foraging became highly specialized. Humans observed which animals survived in the new environment and developed techniques to capture or scavenge them without unnecessary risk. Traps were refined, coordinated hunts became common, and knowledge of edible plants expanded rapidly. Scarcity forced humans to become experts in every aspect of survival, which roots nourished, which barks could be boiled into digestible forms, and which insects provided vital protein. Every meal was earned through observation, knowledge, and cooperation. Community bonds strengthened under these pressures. Migration required collective effort, constructing shelters, finding water, and sharing food. Cooperation became essential, not optional. The young learned from elders, the infirm were protected, and disputes over scarcity were resolved with careful negotiation. Survival depended not only on individual skill but on the ability of the group to function as a coordinated unit. Every step forward was both a physical and social triumph. The psychological toll was profound. Hunger, fatigue, and uncertainty tested the human spirit daily. Yet rituals, songs, and storytelling preserved morale. Around fires, elders recounted ancestral lessons, tales of survival, and small victories against scarcity. Humor, music, and collective remembrance transformed despair into determination. The mind, trained to endure, became as vital as the body, shaping decisions, inspiring courage, and maintaining hope. Humans also learned to anticipate recurring challenges. The famine of one season was rarely the last. Knowledge of drought cycles, migration patterns of prey, and the most resilient plants became critical. Seeds were preserved, small stores of dried roots and bark were hidden, and careful observation ensured that even in scarcity, the next generation could survive. Humans had discovered foresight, a powerful tool that allowed them not only to endure but to prepare. Through migration, adaptation, and ingenuity, humans began to transform famine into experience. Every journey over barren lands, every discovery of hidden food, every coordinated hunt reinforced the principle that survival was not random luck, but a combination of knowledge, skill, and cooperation. Communities became repositories of accumulated wisdom, passing down techniques, observations, and stories that ensured continuity in the face of scarcity. In time, humans discovered a measure of triumph. They learned to thrive where others perished, to coax sustenance from harsh environments, and to anticipate the rhythms of scarcity. Even the bitterest roots, the toughest barks, and the small amounts of clay became symbols of endurance and learning. Every sunrise was a victory, every safe shelter a testament to strategy, and every shared meal a triumph of cooperation. Humans had transformed the trials of famine into a profound understanding of life itself. The lessons of famine endured long after scarcity eased. Techniques, rituals, and cultural practices developed during these dark times became embedded in the identity of humans. Knowledge of edible plants, storage methods, and communal care was preserved through generations. The mental discipline forged by hunger, patience, observation, and problem-solving became a foundation for later achievements. Humans had endured not only because they found food, but because they cultivated intelligence, resilience, and unity. And so even as the land slowly recovered and crops returned, the wisdom born of famine remained. Humans had been shaped by hunger, driven by necessity, and guided by observation. They had transformed desperation into innovation, scarcity into strategy, and suffering into understanding. The memory of roots, bark, and clay was never forgotten, for it represented the indomitable human spirit, small, vulnerable, yet capable of enduring, adapting, and triumphing against the harshest conditions the earth could impose. Even as famine waned and rains returned, humans carried with them the hard-won knowledge of scarcity, the memory of barren fields, bitter roots, and the occasional desperate chew of clay lingered in both body and mind. They had survived not by chance, but through observation, ingenuity, and cooperation. This knowledge became the foundation upon which a new relationship with the earth was built, one of respect, preparation, and foresight. Humans began to experiment with agriculture in ways shaped by the memory of famine. They learned to plant seeds not only where the soil was rich, but also where water could be collected, where frost would arrive later, and where the sun's rays would nourish without scorching. Crops were rotated, stored carefully, and supplemented, with hardy plants discovered during lean years. Techniques for drying, preserving, and protecting seeds became standard practices. The lessons of scarcity had transformed humans into planners, strategists, and guardians of life itself. The knowledge of famine also shaped cultural practices. Communities developed rituals around planting and harvesting, often accompanied by songs, chants, and stories that embedded practical guidance into memory. Elders reminded younger generations of the consequences of neglect, teaching them to respect the rhythms of the earth. Each ritual was both practical and symbolic, a ceremony honoring survival, a guide for future planning, and a reinforcement of communal bonds. The stories of eating roots, bark, and clay were never forgotten. They were taught as warnings, as wisdom, and as reminders of resilience. Innovation accelerated. Humans began to create tools specifically designed for efficient planting, harvesting, and storage. Baskets, granaries, and storage pits were refined to protect against both decay and theft. Knowledge of the nutritional value of plants expanded, and humans experimented with combining foods to maximize sustenance. Even clay, once eaten out of desperation, inspired the careful study of minerals and their uses in building and tool-making. Scarcity had sparked creativity, transforming survival strategies into long-term innovations that would sustain generations. Communities grew stronger. Shared experiences of famine reinforced trust, cooperation, and leadership. Those who had guided their people through the harshest times became respected elders and advisors. Knowledge of the land, weather patterns, and edible plants was codified in oral traditions, ensuring that no generation would be caught unprepared. Communities that embraced these lessons thrived, while those that ignored them were often left vulnerable to recurrence. Famine had taught that survival depended on the intelligence, organization, and unity of the group. Psychologically, humans had been transformed. Endurance in times of scarcity had strengthened problem-solving, patience, and observation. They had learned to anticipate challenges, manage fear, and make decisions under pressure. Even the youngest children absorbed these skills, learning through play, imitation, and guided instruction. Humans had discovered that mental fortitude, alongside physical ability, was essential for enduring the harsh realities of the world. Knowledge became as crucial as food, strategy as vital as strength. The landscape itself was no longer merely a place to traverse, it became a teacher. Humans remembered which lands had failed to produce, which areas hid edible roots, and which soils held water beneath layers of frost. Observation of animal behavior remained crucial. The presence of certain birds or insects indicated fertile grounds, while other signs warned of scarcity or danger. Humans had learned to read the environment as a living text, interpreting patterns and rhythms to guide action. Every journey, every planting, and every harvest became informed by this intricate understanding of nature. Even in times of abundance, the echoes of famine persisted. Humans continued to ration, preserve, and monitor resources. They shared knowledge with younger generations, ensuring that memory and experience remained alive. The act of storing surplus, preparing for lean years, and respecting the land became central to culture. Scarcity had taught patience, foresight, and humility, and these lessons shaped not only survival but society itself. In this way, famine transformed humans in multiple dimensions, physically, mentally, and culturally. The hunger that once seemed insurmountable had forged skills, strategies, and resilience that would carry forward through centuries. Every root dug, bark chewed, and morsel of clay consumed became a lesson etched into memory. Survival had required observation, cooperation, and innovation, and the knowledge gained became a legacy far richer than any temporary abundance. The endurance of humans in famine also inspired a profound respect for life and resources. Waste became unthinkable. Every seed, every plant, every scrap of food was valued. Humans learned to anticipate scarcity before it arrived, preparing with foresight that allowed them to thrive in conditions that had once been deadly. Hunger had taught humility, vigilance, and gratitude, qualities that became embedded in culture, passed through story, ritual, and daily practice. Finally, humans had learned that resilience was not merely survival, it was transformation. Scarcity had sharpened minds, strengthened communities, and fostered innovation. Knowledge accumulated through hardship became a tool for life itself, ensuring that future generations would endure even harsher conditions. The memory of famine shaped agriculture, technology, social organization, and culture. It reminded humans that life was fragile, yet full of potential, and that through observation, creativity, and unity, scarcity could be met with intelligence rather than despair. Through hunger, suffering, and the harsh lessons of scarcity, humans discovered the essence of endurance. They learned to convert desperation into strategy, weakness into wisdom, and loss into knowledge. Every community that survived famine carried forward this heritage, a testament to the unbreakable human spirit and the power of learning from the most extreme challenges nature could impose. Humanity had endured, adapted, and emerged wiser, its future shaped by the bitter lessons of the past. Even after famine receded, the memory of hunger remained etched into human culture. Humans had learned that scarcity could strike again at any time, and so movement became a deliberate strategy rather than a last resort. Tribes and families began to migrate systematically, searching for fertile lands, reliable water sources, and areas rich in edible plants. These migrations were guided by knowledge accumulated over generations, the location of hidden springs, seasonal cycles of vegetation, and animal migration patterns. Every journey was informed by intelligence honed under duress. Migration fostered contact between previously isolated communities. Humans shared knowledge of survival techniques, from storing seeds and processing roots to identifying safe bark and clay. These exchanges reinforced cooperation, broadened cultural understanding, and allowed innovations to spread rapidly across regions. Communities that once struggled alone now learned from one another, blending the lessons of hardship into collective wisdom. Scarcity had taught humans the value of connection, and this insight began to reshape societies. Trade emerged as a natural extension of survival knowledge. Communities with fertile soil or unique resources exchanged seeds, tools, preserved food, and even knowledge of medicinal plants with distant neighbors. Barter became more than an economic act. It was a survival strategy. Tribes that traded regularly could anticipate shortages, access new techniques, and buffer themselves against future famine. Trade routes followed the same careful observations that had guided migration. Rivers, valleys, and animal trails became pathways not only for humans, but for the knowledge they carried. Famine also spurred technological advancement. Humans developed better storage techniques to preserve seeds and dried food for longer periods. Clay, once eaten in desperation, was transformed into containers and pots for cooking, storing water, and transporting goods. Sharp tools and digging. Implements allowed more efficient collection of roots and tubers, while fire was harnessed to process food, making previously inedible resources safe to consume. Scarcity forced creativity, and innovation became a means of survival that also strengthened community resilience. Cultural practices evolved alongside these innovations. Rituals, songs, and storytelling reinforced the lessons of famine, teaching future generations how to prepare, observe, and cooperate. Festivals celebrated the first harvests after scarcity, honoring both the land and the ingenuity of humans who had survived its hardships. Stories of ancestors who had eaten roots, bark, or clay were not merely remembered, they were celebrated, encoded as essential wisdom for survival and prosperity. Knowledge became tradition, and tradition became a tool for endurance. The psychological impact of famine shaped governance and social organization. Communities that survived best were those that had strong cooperation, clear leadership, and shared responsibility. Elders guided decisions about migration, rationing, and conflict resolution. Roles within the tribe became defined by skill and knowledge rather than strength alone, and humans learned to value intellect and observation as much as physical prowess. Scarcity had taught them that survival was a collective effort, and social cohesion became as vital as food itself. Migration also led humans to explore and settle new continents. Scarcity compelled tribes to traverse oceans, rivers, mountains, and plains, discovering lands that were previously unknown. They carried seeds, knowledge, and technology with them, planting the foundations of civilizations in distant regions. Every new settlement was built on the lessons of famine. Careful observation, resource management, and foresight. Scarcity had accelerated the spread of human innovation, planting the seeds for agriculture, trade, and social complexity across the globe. Even the very concept of time and planning evolved under famine. Humans learned to anticipate seasonal cycles, track the growth of plants, and plan storage and migration according to months and years rather than days. This temporal awareness allowed them to survive recurring shortages and prepare for harsh winters. Knowledge of time became a survival skill, reinforcing the link between observation, memory, and strategic planning. Humans had begun to think in generations, shaping long-term resilience rather than reacting only to immediate scarcity. Through famine, humans had gained an understanding of interdependence. Every survival strategy relied on observation, cooperation, and communication. The lessons of roots, bark, and clay extended beyond nutrition. They became lessons in intelligence, empathy, and foresight. Communities that integrated these lessons were stronger, better organized, and more likely to endure future crises. Scarcity had taught humans not only to survive, but to thrive collectively. Ultimately, famine had sown the seeds of civilization itself. The challenges of scarcity prompted humans to innovate, cooperate, and expand across continents. Knowledge became portable, culture became structured, and survival strategies became traditions. Humans emerged from famine not merely as survivors, but as architects of society capable of transforming hardship into systems of trade, governance, agriculture, and communal life. The bitter lessons of scarcity have become a foundation for progress, ensuring that humanity could endure, adapt, and build a future even in the face of nature's harshest trials. Humans had learned that life was fragile, yet adaptive. Hunger had sharpened the mind, strengthened bonds, and inspired ingenuity. Knowledge gained from famine informed every aspect of human existence: movement, agriculture, social organization, trade, and culture. Even when abundance returned, the memory of scarcity guided decision-making, ensuring that future generations were equipped not just to survive, but to understand the value of resources, cooperation, and foresight. And so famine, once a force of despair, became a teacher, shaping humans into resilient, intelligent, and socially cohesive beings. The lessons of survival, roots, bark, clay, observation, cooperation, and ingenuity were never forgotten. They were woven into the very fabric of human civilization, reminding all who came after that even in the harshest times, humans could endure, adapt, and triumph. Even after the land had recovered and crops flourished once more, the shadow of famine lingered in human memory. Scarcity had left an indelible mark, shaping not only survival strategies, but also culture, innovation, and societal structures. Humans realized that the lessons of hunger were not temporary. They were tools to navigate an unpredictable world, a repository of wisdom that ensured the continuation of life across generations. Food became more than sustenance. It became a symbol, a source of knowledge, and a measure of human ingenuity. Storage techniques improved, with granaries carefully constructed to preserve seeds and dried foods against pests, moisture, and time. Communities learned to prepare for scarcity before it struck, using their understanding of soil, climate, and seasonal patterns to anticipate future needs. Every loaf baked, every seed stored, and every root preserved carried with it the hard-won lessons of famine. Innovation flourished as a direct result of scarcity. Humans developed tools and techniques for more efficient agriculture, foraging, and hunting. Clay, once eaten in desperation, was transformed into pots, containers, and even primitive kilns. Fire was used to process foods that had previously been inedible, improving nutrition and safety. Observation became a science. Humans tracked weather, plant growth, and animal movements with precision, turning the world into a living classroom of survival. Scarcity had nurtured creativity, and that creativity became a permanent feature of human life. Cultural practices and traditions solidified around the memory of famine. Rituals associated with planting, harvesting, and communal meals became embedded in society. Stories of ancestors who had survived lean years were passed down through generations, serving both as warnings and as guides. Songs, chants, and ceremonies reinforced knowledge of edible plants, safe storage methods, and the importance of cooperation. Survival was not only practical, it became moral and social, shaping how communities functioned and how individuals understood their place in the world. Community cohesion became essential. Humans had learned that survival depended on collaboration, empathy, and social intelligence. Elders were respected for their experience and knowledge. Children were trained in observation, foraging, and care. Disputes were mediated carefully as conflict threatened the survival of the entire group. Scarcity had taught humans that life was interdependent, that every member of a community contributed to collective endurance, and that cooperation was a weapon against the unpredictability of nature. The psychological impact of famine also endured. Humans developed resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. Hunger had forced individuals to prioritize, observe, and make difficult decisions. These skills carried into times of abundance, allowing humans to innovate, plan, and manage resources with foresight. The memory of scarcity trained the mind to anticipate challenges, creating a mental toolkit that became as valuable as any physical adaptation. Famine shaped migration patterns and human settlement. Communities became mobile when necessary, understanding that the earth was not uniform in its ability to provide sustenance. Migration was guided by observation, knowledge of seasons, and awareness of fertile land. Humans began to map territories, establish trade routes, and anticipate future shortages. Movement was no longer haphazard, it was informed, strategic, and deeply connected to survival knowledge accumulated over generations. Trade emerged as a sophisticated response to scarcity. Communities exchanged seeds, preserved foods, tools, and knowledge, creating networks that ensured survival even in the harshest conditions. Barter became a means of resilience. It was a way to distribute risk, access rare resources, and transmit knowledge across regions. Scarcity had transformed human interaction into a structured system, laying the groundwork for economic and social complexity that would define civilizations for millennia. Even agriculture was forever altered. Humans no longer relied solely on chance. They manipulated the environment, rotated crops, stored surplus, and experimented with new varieties. Techniques developed during famine, drying, preservation, irrigation, and soil management became standard practice. Knowledge of edible plants expanded, and humans were able to cultivate previously overlooked species. The bitter roots and tough bark that had once sustained life became part of a broader understanding of nutrition and resilience. Ultimately, famine left humans not broken, but stronger. Scarcity had honed observation, creativity, cooperation, and endurance. It had taught lessons that extended far beyond immediate survival: respect for resources, foresight in planning, innovation in technology, and empathy within communities. Every hardship endured became a foundation for growth, every desperate meal a lesson in ingenuity, and every collective effort a template for societal development. The legacy of famine was profound. It shaped culture, knowledge, social structures, and the very way humans interacted with the world. Communities learned to anticipate challenges, innovate solutions, and value each member's contribution. Scarcity had transformed humanity from a group of fragile survivors into intelligent, adaptable, and socially cohesive beings. The lessons of hunger became a blueprint for endurance, innovation, and civilization itself. And so, even generations later, when fields were lush and food abundant, the memory of famine persisted, not as trauma, but as wisdom. Humans had learned that life could be precarious, that scarcity could strike without warning, and that survival required observation, ingenuity, and cooperation. The bitter lessons of roots, bark, and clay became a heritage of resilience, a reminder that humanity's strength lay not just in physical endurance, but in intellect, culture, and unity. Through famine, humans had endured the harshest tests of existence. They had learned to observe, innovate, and cooperate. Scarcity had forged minds capable of foresight, communities capable of organization, and cultures capable of preserving knowledge. In the end, famine was not merely a trial, it was a teacher, shaping the human species into a resilient, adaptive, and enduring force capable of transforming hardship into the foundation of civilization itself. Even long after the famine had passed, its echoes persisted in human bodies, minds, and societies. The lessons of scarcity became embedded not only in culture and knowledge, but in subtle adaptations passed from generation to generation. Humans had learned to endure, to anticipate, and to innovate. Hunger, once a dire adversary, had forged an enduring blueprint for survival that would shape the species for millennia. Physiologically, humans developed resilience in remarkable ways. Bodies became attuned to scarcity, able to conserve energy when resources were thin, and to extract maximum nutrition from minimal food. Metabolism, once a simple mechanism of consumption, evolved into a finely tuned system capable of enduring prolonged periods of hardship. Children born into these post-famine generations inherited lessons encoded in behavior as well as physiology, instinctively rationing energy and carefully assessing their surroundings. Hunger had left its mark not only in history, but in the very design of the human body. Psychologically, humans became vigilant, observant, and strategic. Communities that remembered the horrors of famine were cautious with resources, meticulous in planning, and cooperative in execution. Memory of scarcity sharpened decision-making, heightening awareness of risk and teaching patience in the face of uncertainty. Even storytelling, song, and ritual carried a dual function, preserving culture, yes, but also embedding practical strategies for future scarcity. Fear had been transformed into foresight, desperation into disciplined planning. Culturally, the legacy of famine was profound. Societies organized around resource management, cooperation, and careful observation. Festivals, ceremonies, and communal gatherings celebrated not just abundance, but survival itself. Tales of ancestors who had chewed roots, boiled bark, and even nibbled clay were told not as grim reminders, but as symbols of ingenuity and resilience. The memory of famine became a moral compass, guiding social behavior toward cooperation, empathy, and shared responsibility. Communities thrived not only because they cultivated the land, but because they cultivated wisdom and unity. Trade and migration, born of necessity during scarcity, became permanent features of human civilization. Routes first traced to find food became arteries of cultural exchange, spreading knowledge, technology, and innovation across regions and continents. Seeds carried by migrating tribes became the foundation of agriculture in distant lands. Tools refined to extract maximum sustenance from scarce resources were improved, traded, and adapted. Scarcity had sparked creativity, and that creativity had become the engine of civilization. Even spirituality and ritual bore the imprint of famine. Humans developed practices to honor the land, respect animals, and acknowledge the fragile balance between survival and abundance. Each planting season was observed with careful ritual, each harvest marked by gratitude. Scarcity had taught humans humility, a recognition that life could be both generous and cruel, and that respect for the natural world was inseparable from survival. Ritual, once a cultural ornament, had become a tool for endurance, memory, and foresight. The famine also shaped social hierarchies and leadership. Those who had guided communities through scarcity gained authority and respect, their strategies codified into traditions and social rules. Skills in observation, resource management, and cooperation became prized, and intelligence and social insight were valued alongside strength. Communities that integrated these lessons endured, grew, and eventually prospered, while those that neglected them were often left vulnerable to recurring challenges. Scarcity had forged social sophistication from necessity. Education, too, was transformed. Children were trained not only in the arts of survival, but in observation, strategy, and knowledge of the land. Every story, every ritual, every teaching was layered with lessons of endurance. Knowledge became portable, cultural memory became practical, and learning became inseparable from life itself. Post-famine generations were stronger, smarter, and more adaptable because they carried the wisdom of hardship. Scarcity had become an invisible teacher, shaping not only what humans did, but how they thought. Over the centuries, famine left a subtle but permanent imprint on human identity. The memory of roots, bark, and clay became symbols of perseverance. Communities understood that abundance was fragile, that survival depended on cooperation and foresight, and that wisdom, strategy, and unity were as vital as strength or speed. Scarcity had instilled a reverence for life itself, a cautious optimism, and a relentless drive to adapt and innovate. Humans had learned to endure, and in the process, they had evolved physically, mentally, culturally, and socially. Even when hunger was no longer immediate, its lessons shaped philosophy, art, and story. Tales of endurance were told to teach courage, patience, and foresight. Songs evoked the rhythm of foraging, planting, and preserving. Rituals honored not only abundance, but the struggle that had made survival possible. Scarcity became a teacher of character, morality, and intellect, and humanity carried these lessons forward, woven into every generation, every society, and every act of creation. And so, the echoes of famine lived on. They were not merely memories of pain or deprivation, they were a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and cooperation. Scarcity had forced humans to innovate, to observe, to plan, and to unite. It had left them stronger, wiser, and better prepared for the challenges of an unpredictable world. Hunger, once a fearsome adversary, had become a mentor, shaping a species capable of transforming hardship into enduring strength and leaving a legacy that would endure in every corner of the earth. Even as centuries passed and abundance returned, to lands once ravaged by famine, the memory of scarcity remained a subtle but guiding force in human life. Humans had learned that survival was never guaranteed, that abundance could vanish as quickly as it appeared. Scarcity had become more than a historical event. It had become a teacher, shaping the instincts, decisions, and values of humanity in ways that persisted long after hunger itself had faded. Knowledge born from famine became a cornerstone of civilization. Techniques for storing food, cultivating crops, and managing water were refined and codified. Communities that once relied solely on immediate resources now planned years in advance, observing soil fertility, rainfall patterns, and seasonal cycles. Seeds were preserved, stockpiles carefully managed, and food-sharing strategies implemented. Scarcity had instilled foresight and planning into human culture, transforming reaction into anticipation and improvisation into structured strategy. But the lessons of famine were not purely practical, they were moral and social as well. Humans had learned to cooperate under extreme stress, to place communal survival above personal desire. Elders were respected for their wisdom, children trained in careful observation and patient endurance. Empathy, negotiation, and collective effort were no longer optional, they were essential tools for life itself. Scarcity had forged social cohesion and trust, embedding the understanding that every member of a group contributed to the survival of all. Psychologically, humans became resilient in ways both subtle and profound. Scarcity taught patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to endure discomfort without surrendering to despair. The mind learned to measure risk, to anticipate outcomes, and to conserve effort when resources were limited. These mental adaptations became part of daily life long after famine ended. Humans had internalized endurance, learning to face challenges with measured action rather than panic. The experience of hunger had sharpened intellect, heightened observation, and strengthened will. Culture, art, and ritual were forever influenced by scarcity. Stories of ancestors who had survived lean times, were immortalized in song, dance, and ceremony. Festivals celebrated not just harvest, but survival itself, the triumph of life over adversity. Tales of bitter roots, tough bark, and even clay became allegories of perseverance, teaching courage, ingenuity, and moral strength. Humans remembered not only the pain of scarcity, but the strategies, cooperation, and intelligence that had allowed them to endure. Knowledge and culture became inseparable. Trade, migration, and exploration were also shaped by the memory of famine. Humans spread across continents carrying seeds, tools, and knowledge to new lands. Routes first traced in search of sustenance became networks of exchange, linking communities across vast distances. Scarcity had not only taught endurance, but had created curiosity, exploration, and innovation. The hardships of the past became the impetus for connecting, exchanging, and expanding human knowledge and society. Even philosophy and governance bore the mark of scarcity. Leaders who had guided their people through hunger were respected, their strategies codified into traditions and social structures. Decision-making emphasized prudence, foresight, and cooperation. Laws, customs, and social hierarchies evolved to protect resources, distribute responsibility, and ensure collective resilience. Scarcity had fostered intelligence, foresight, and social sophistication in ways no abundance could replicate. Humans also learned to value the invisible, patience, foresight, observation, and communal wisdom. Scarcity had taught that survival depended not solely on physical strength but on understanding, adaptability, and shared knowledge. Every act, planting, storing, foraging, observing, became imbued with meaning. Scarcity had revealed that the unseen qualities of mind and society could be as powerful as any tool or weapon. Even in modern times, long after famine had faded from memory, its lessons persisted in instinct, culture, and tradition. The human species had internalized the wisdom of scarcity, carrying it into agriculture, trade, governance, and education. Every careful decision about resources, every act of cooperation, every story passed to the next generation was a thread connecting humanity to its past struggles. Scarcity had become an enduring teacher, shaping intellect, character, and civilization itself. Ultimately, famine had revealed the essence of human resilience. Hunger had forced humans to innovate, to cooperate, to observe, and to endure. Scarcity had been a mentor, harsh and unforgiving, yet infinitely instructive. Through its trials, humans had learned that survival was not merely a function of strength, but of intelligence, empathy, and foresight. The echoes of famine had become embedded in the very fabric of humanity, a quiet, invisible guide teaching every generation that even in the harshest conditions life could endure, adapt, and flourish.